I hope you can hear me clearly, and I've been told your understanding of English is very good. I'm sure it's much better than my Russian. So my name is Jonathan Evan's. I'm First Secretary in the British Embassy in Moscow, and my colleague.
And my name is Sam Jeremy, and I'm also a First Secretary in the British Embassy in Moscow.
And we realized it had been 6 years since the last visit of a representative of the British Embassy in Moscow to Altai Republic and Altai Territory. So we were in Barnaul this week and now in Gorno-Altaysk to understand more about the region. We look a lot at the politics inside Russia, outside Russia, and in our embassy as a whole. Of course, we're dealing with the whole range of the relationship between Russia and the UK. We wanted to come and talk to you this morning, have a discussion, and I think we don't have a very fixed agenda. I think one thing we were hoping to talk about was your aspirations for the future. We also wanted to talk to you a bit about the kind of activity there is going on now between Britain and Russia, including in the sphere of education. And I'm sure there must be questions on your side as well. And we'd be very happy to have a further discussion. Oh yeah, and we just a bit more about our background. So I'm fairly new to this region. I actually had a previous posting doing work in Nigeria, and that was very interesting work. In fact, we both have a background in work in Africa, and in Nigeria, I was covering the northern part of the country. And looking at the terrorist issue, particularly the Boko Haram group, and obviously terrorism is an issue that's very current now internationally, and also an issue that concerns both the UK and Russia. And then, how about you, Sam?
And I'm also relatively new to Russia. I've been living here now in Moscow for 1.5 years, and my background. Originally I was an engineer in the oil industry, so I used to work in Azerbaijan for a year working on oil facilities, and then in the foreign ministry I've spent 3 years working in Africa with the African Union and trying to build the capacity of the African Union to stop conflict in Africa. And then I've worked in Iraq for 1 year in Baghdad on the oil ministry with the Iraqi oil companies, and then I came to Russia.
So maybe what we could do is I can mention a few things a few things in common between in terms of the bilateral relationship, and then maybe we can open it for questions and answers. I just wanted to emphasize there have been a few things, even though at the political level things are sometimes better, sometimes worse, but very much at the people-to-people level, there's a lot of activity that continues and has continued for a long time. And just a few examples of that. So this year we have the Year of Language and Literature, and the British Council is very involved in that. And that's a series of events between Russia and Britain involving anything connected to history of language and of literature, including Shakespeare. And recently it was 400 years since the death of Shakespeare. And there's a series of events to celebrate the cultural links that exist between Russia and the UK. So for example, the Tretyakov Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery in London have been carrying out an exchange of paintings, and it's been very successful and lots of people have attended. And there's also recently a cosmonauts exhibition in London, which involved the loan of a whole range of space equipment, and that was exhibited in London. And again, it had a very high interest. Another example I could think of recently was the BBC made a production of War and Peace, which is, Russian literature has a high readership in the UK, a lot of interest, and I think that will continue. Do you want to mention the evening?
Yeah, we also have a program. At the end I will read out the website address, but we have a program of scholarships for Russian students who sometimes go to British universities, and when they finish their undergraduate degree they might do a master's in whichever subject they like, so it could be engineering or science or the press or politics, anything. And so we have been organising this, and we meet many Russian students in Moscow, and then some of them go to London and other British universities.
So maybe now's an appropriate time to ask if you have any questions for us, and we do our best to try and answer them.
While students will think, my question will be about safety, the safety of population in Britain. We know from the news on federal channels of Russia that the whole Europe suffers from a very, let's say, unstable situation, both political and economical. How would you characterize and describe the situation in Great Britain? How do people feel about being safe in their own country? This is what I really think of.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that living in Britain at the moment, it actually feels relatively safe. I don't think people feel in any danger. We have, as always, exciting politics. So at the moment we have in 1 month a referendum on whether Britain will stay in the European Union or leave the European Union. So it's quite an exciting time in politics in Britain, and quite uncertain. But I think maybe the issue you're talking about is related to Syria and the refugees who are coming to Europe and the migrants. And it's certainly true that there have been a lot of them. So for example, in Germany, I think more than 1 million people have come from Syria. Actually, to Britain, fewer people have come but partially geographically, because we have the sea in the way. So it's more difficult for them to reach Britain. But also because the British government has a different approach to refugees from Syria, and the British government thinks that it's better for us to take refugees from refugee camps in Jordan and other neighbouring countries and bring them directly to Britain, rather than them making dangerous journeys by sea from Turkey to Greece and then entering. So actually the numbers have been relatively small in Britain, but it's certainly true that we still have a lot of migrants in Britain. We yesterday had the statistics released, and I think the net migration this year was 330,000 people. So this is the balance of people coming and going. On the whole, 330,000 new people arrived. And it's certainly true that some people in Britain feel that this makes the pressure on public services, it makes it difficult to find school places, hospital places. But other people and the economists say, well, it's very good for the economy, and actually it's very welcome that these people come. So there's quite a healthy debate, and many people have different opinions. But I think in terms of safety, it feels to me very safe in Britain. I don't know, Jonathan, if you...
I think obviously there is as Sam mentioned, there's a constant debate about what is the right number of migrants coming to the UK, and that includes both legal migration and illegal. But I should add as well that in the UK, the issue is reported as a very important issue, but very much alongside the other issues. So it's not. It's often at the top of the headlines, but it's not every day at the top of the headlines. And as Sam mentioned, because of where the UK is located, we're over in the west of Europe, we have faced less direct pressure from the situation in the Middle East than in Greece and some of the and Italy, some of the countries more to the south and the east. In terms of the migration issue as a whole, Middle East is obviously one big issue, and the other one is European migration. So as we're in the European Union, there's freedom of movement within the European Union. So if I, as a British citizen, if I wanted to go and work in Germany, I could just go. I don't need a special permission with my EU. With the UK being a member of the EU, I can just get on a train and go and take a job. The debate is around the movement of people to different parts of the EU, and sometimes they don't necessarily have jobs, and so that's a lot of the debate behind the referendum that we will have, as I mentioned, on the 23rd of June. So the debate is quite strong around that right now. But I think on this issue, I mean, although of course it's an important issue, but a key aspect of it is how is it dealt with, and how does debate happen around this issue? Are people's views heard? Can open discussion happen? And right now, I think even last night there was a debate on television in the UK with different representatives of different parties putting their view. You know, we think we should leave the EU. We think that we should stay in the EU. All these views were represented. Just on the broader issue of safety, just a bit about the terrorism issue. As you may know, in the past we had a terrorism issue in Northern Ireland, and the terrorist group, the Irish Republican Army, IRA, over a long period carried out attacks, bombing attacks, and it was a long period of instability in Northern Ireland, and happily we're in a much better position now. It still hasn't completely, there's still tensions and it hasn't completely gone away, but there's now a power sharing agreement between people in Northern Ireland who would like Northern Ireland to be part of Ireland, and those people who very much want it to stay in the UK. And it's been a long and difficult process, but it's been pretty successful over the last few years. And then the more recent issue is obviously the terrorism with links to the Middle East, and a particular moment for the UK was in 2005, the 7th of July 2005, when there were two large bomb attacks in London that killed over 50 people, one on our metro and the other on a bus, and it was a moment when the whole population realized that the threat from terrorism was very real. And since then, the law enforcement agencies, security agencies have been working very hard to prevent further attacks. And I think, like Russia, one issue we face is British citizens who are recruited and who go and fight for Islamic State, IGIL, in Middle East. And so that's a constant issue that we're dealing with. And I think it's obviously another issue where there is, as I mentioned, there's one of several issues where there's common interest between UK and Russia.
More questions?
You said that about some programs for Russian students for studying in British university. Are there any programs as, for example, American Fulbright in Britain? Because it's impossible to find a similar program in Britain. Maybe they exist, but I don't know. So.
We do have a similar program. It's slightly different, and what we do is once every year, I think maybe in September, we put an advert on Facebook, on other social media, and people can apply for this scholarship. And I think we have probably only 20 places for the whole of Russia. But maybe this year we had 100 applicants, and we interviewed 40 applicants, and we selected the people we interviewed in Yekaterinburg, in St. Petersburg, and in Moscow. And as I say, these are people who have completed their degrees, and we're particularly, in our scholarship, looking for people who we think have potential to be future leaders in their areas. So it can be any area. It could be a future leader in environmental issues, or a future leader in press issues, or a future leader in a political leader or business leader. And these are the sorts of, when we look through the application forms and we read the things that students write, these are the qualities we look for. I'll give you, if you are interested, the website address, and then you can have a look yourself. So the program is called Chevening, which is, it's called Chevening. I'll spell it for you. It's CHEVENING. So it's worldwideweb.chevening.org. You can find this, and that's our program.
And also, of course, the students have already mentioned Fulbright Program, and that's a very nice program that gives the universities from different countries of the world to invite native speakers to teach English. Is there any similar program that would probably help us to invite native speakers from Great Britain?
I think that we don't have a formalised program, but it's something that the British Council is always trying to do. And I think because we don't have a formalised program, it relies on, it's important for exactly that we're coming here today to meet you and to meet the students. And I think there are lots of people in Britain who would be happy to come and speak English at universities, talk to universities, but obviously, first of all, we have to make the connections. So I know that our British Council works a lot with universities in Moscow. They talk to them very frequently, and they have some such links and some teachers coming. But it's obviously important for us to travel around the country and meet people, and maybe we can discuss this afterwards.
So it can be organized on the individual.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. You can ask any questions you like about anything, okay.
You've mentioned that the security agency is working hard to prevent terrorism in the UK, and I'm interested if British people worry of that security agency might have to have some private information, might have to collect some private data, and do British people worry about it?
It's a very good question, which we talk about a lot. So I'll tell you what I think, and then Jonathan can tell you what he thinks, which might be slightly different. So this debate has been going on in the UK, I think, now for quite a long time, maybe 10 years. Certainly since the bombing that Jonathan mentioned in London, it has grown more intensive. It grew more intensive when some people from the United States, maybe you know Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks, when they released their information and the public knew more about what was happening, what the government was doing, it grew more intensive again. And I think the problem has been that, as you probably know, because technology has advanced so quickly. So I think that recently someone made the comparison that maybe 30 years ago, the police in most countries could get a permit, a propusque, and go to someone's house and have a look around, and this was completely legitimate. But now, with iPhones and technology, maybe some people keep all their information electronically, and so the police say, well, before it was very legitimate for us to go to a house, now the house is the iPhone, we need to get into the iPhone. So this might be one of the arguments of the police. But people, I think, British people don't really like this. They think, this is my personal private data, and the police shouldn't be allowed to access this. And the police say, well, if we can't access, we can't make you safe. We have information that terrorists want to plan bomb attacks, and we need to access this information. So there's lots of different arguments. Lots of different people think different things. We have very strong civil society organisations, and they say it's invasion of privacy, you can't do this. The government says we need to do this, it's very important to protect you, and this debate has been going on for 10 years, and it hasn't really finished yet. People aren't entirely sure what the right answer is. They're constantly trying to calibrate, should we have more powers, should we have fewer powers, and the British government in the last 10 years has had legislation, maybe 2 or 3 different new laws, and each time there's a very big debate in the UK, again on television, everybody talks about it a lot, the newspapers, there's lots and lots of discussion, and we have laws which give them certain powers but restrict them. So it's a very good question, and it's an ongoing debate. It hasn't finished yet. People don't really know what the answer is 100%, I think. Jonathan, maybe add?
No, I think that's right. I think the challenge is, as Sam mentioned, the technology, and technology moves so quickly, and computer technology moves forward so quickly that the politics and the laws have to catch up. And the challenge right now is that on the security side, the terrorists and the terrorist recruiters use computers a great deal, and they use social media, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and other applications that will help them carry out their ends. The challenge for the security services is that there's so much information out there. How do they use the information and try and find the terrorists and put a stop to them before they can carry out an attack? And that's an enormous challenge. And that's what this is linked to. But on the other hand, you have large, significant parts of society in the UK who are arguing that actually individuals have a right to keep their own information. Why should that information be shared with anyone? And I think there's also the argument that in the future, if your information, if you put something up on Facebook, for example, and then it gets stored by a security agency, what would stop that information being used against you in the future for political reasons? So there's these kind of debates happening at the moment, and as Sam says, there's no easy answer. But I think the challenge is especially intense at the moment because of the terrorism issue and because of the wide range of ways in which the internet and computer technology is used for terrorist aims.
I don't know if you saw in America recently that they had, the FBI wanted to access an iPhone. And I think if you ask people in Britain, I spoke to lots of my friends and my family, and maybe half the people said they should definitely get into the iPhone, it's very important, fight terrorism, and maybe half the people said, no, of course they can't go in the iPhone, it's private, it's private information. So this is how the split is. And then it's obviously very difficult for the government to work out how it can. The government is democratically elected, it has to represent these people who have all these different views. How do we find some middle ground which can make us safe, but also protect people's privacy? So it's quite a difficult question.
In America, some people live in one state and then they made to move in another state. And is it possible in England if one person live in England and then he move in another part of England? Is it possible?
Thank you for the question. Yes, it is. I mean, and so there is freedom of movement within England and within the United Kingdom. So that's not just England, but Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well, making the United Kingdom together. But there was recently a referendum, another referendum on Scottish independence. Most people voted actually to stay as part of the United Kingdom. If that vote had happened, then there would have been a border between England and Scotland, and things might have been a bit different. But the vote was actually to keep the United Kingdom together. So yes, absolutely, it's free movement.
And maybe it's worth adding that Jonathan mentioned before that it's not just free movement in Britain, it's also free movement in Europe as well. So British people can freely move to any European Union nation. They can, if I was living in London and I want to go and live in Paris tomorrow, I can go, there's no problem. I can go there, I can get a job there. This is part of the European Union rules. And actually, I personally think it's very positive, very good, but as we said before, some people in the UK again think it's not so good because it means everyone can come to the UK as well. So it's mixed opinions. So for example, my sister lives in France. She has a French husband who works in Switzerland. Another sister I have lives in Prague who has a Czech husband, and they could go very freely, my sisters, to these countries.
Thank you very much. And to further the question that Sonia has asked about the mobility of population, is it connected somehow with problems of planning the employment? because the specialists that get education in your country leave the country. For example, they start for Europe, stay there, live there, and work there. But that means that people who got the education, probably the government, the state, thought about this amount of specialists being working in the country, but they left. There is a gap of these working forces?
It's an interesting question, and I think because we're from Britain, the answer is no. But if you ask some people, maybe from Eastern European countries, maybe the answer would be yes, because when they join the European Union, it's all to do with the relative salary levels. So in Britain, people can earn more money, and there are more jobs. And the British economy is doing very well at the moment. London is very strong. So many people come from Poland, from Baltic countries to work. So maybe the Baltic countries have this problem. But usually, eventually, people go back home, maybe after 10 years or 15 years. When they've made lots of money, they go back to their countries. So it's not a permanent problem, but it's certainly a temporary problem. Some people don't go home. They marry British people, and they have families, and they stay in Britain. I don't know.
I think it's a good question, and it doesn't just affect the European Union, because there's been a debate as well about African countries where they train up doctors and so on, and they come and work in our National Health Service, and the environment is a lot easier, the salaries are better, and the debate is around, well, if they have their training from, let's say, Kenya, why don't they stay in Kenya and they can treat the local people rather than coming to come to the West. So that's another part of the debate. I think it's an important question, and it doesn't just affect the EU.
And also, you mentioned that you have many students from Russia. Do you have any data? And one more question, and how many of them come back to Russia? Because I guess that's probably most of them stay in the UK or go to Europe. Do you have any data?
I don't have any fixed data. I just know, as you say, I have absolutely no idea. But what we hear a lot about, lots of British people talk about, is the number of Russian people who live in London. So some people call it Londoner-grad, and there's a very big Russian population in London now, and some streets you only hear Russian language in London. But I don't know about students, unfortunately, but we can find out, and maybe we can tell you. Probably there are people in our embassy who know the answer to this question, but we don't know. But we'll find out, and we will email you the answer.
I mean, I don't know if there's any kind of indication, but right now, I think in our visa department, they're receiving between 500 and 1,000 applications for visas a day, every day. So if you sort of work that out for the year, and a lot of those are student applications, so it gives you some idea about the volumes involved.
There is a strong civil society in the UK, and how do students participate in it, in the civil society life, and what do they do?
Yes, there is a strong civil society, and students take part in it in a wide range of ways. Obviously, civil society is quite a broad term, and it can involve a whole range of activities. I mean, I think one obvious one on the student side is there are student unions in each university, and then there's the National Union of Students, which has some influence on the national scene. There's also, I think, at universities, there's students often typically become involved in things they're enthusiastic about. So, I think it can range from, I think I see this as part of civil society as well. So it could be a sports club, for example, which is run on community lines, and which has to raise its own money to keep itself going. So in some universities, rowing is very popular. To entrepreneurs networks. Entrepreneurship is quite an important part of British society, and new businesses coming up, and students get very involved in that kind of activity. And then some of the other activity might include a bit more student activism around certain issues. So I mentioned this information security and what happens with that. The right to protect information. It could be a society which is quite vocal about that kind of issue as well. So it's a whole range. And I think in particular, university is a time when a lot of people have an interest in something and then they decide to pursue it.
Maybe in Russian education here is a lot of changes now, and one of maybe very important modern tendency is students' mobility. I know that in the UK, British students' schedule is more flexible, for example, than in Russia. And as for example, their mobility, their chances to go abroad, what countries they prefer?
So if I understand correctly, what countries do British students prefer to travel to? I think I'd be right in saying it's mostly either the US, the United States, or other parts of Europe. And on the Europe side, there are some schemes which enable you, if you're doing a 3-year degree, you can take 1 extra year, and that year is spent somewhere in Europe, and you will take part in a course in the European university. You'll do some language classes. When I was at university, I didn't in the end, but I almost went to France to take part in a program like this. It's the Erasmus program. So you end up doing a 4-year degree, but you've had a year in another country in Europe, and you've had language lessons included. And then obviously, the United States, because the language is no problem, and the US sees the British education system as being of a good standard. So what you sometimes find is the undergraduate degree takes place in the UK, and then the graduate degree, masters, PhDs in the US or other parts of Europe.
Many students these days do a thing called a gap year, which probably started maybe when I was at university, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and many students do it these days. When they finish school, when they're 18 years old, they have 1 year off, and they either work or they go traveling, or they do charity work. They might go to Africa and do some charity work, and then they go to university to do their degree. And some people do this gap year, it's called, after university. So they do their degree, then they have 1 year doing exactly the same things, maybe some charity work or traveling, and then they start a job. So this is another big trend in Britain at the moment.
Thank you.
I did do one, but I didn't do a very exciting one because I studied engineering for 4 years. So my gap year was working for an engineering company before university, and I just did a normal job for 1 year in Britain. So this is the least exciting type of gap year. The most exciting type of gap year, which many students do now, is they go to Africa, and I think they have more fun than I had. I was just working, unfortunately.
To leave the gap year without work or not studying, you need money. Where do you get the money from?
It's very true, and actually it's the reason why this started, I think, this is a very bad reason and a very bad answer. But the reason it started was because it's all linked in with the global financial crisis. But many students got credit cards, and they had access to credit. So no, initially they had access to credit from the banks, and it became very easy to get money. The banks were lending money very easily, so students, including myself, could borrow lots of money. It's not, that's why I say it's a very bad answer, but that is how I did it. I think a lot of people today, their parents give them money. And particularly in Britain, the house prices have gone up very rapidly. And many people the age of my parents have have a lot of wealth in their house prices. It's a very particular trend in the United Kingdom. It's very different from other parts of Europe. So there's a lot of money in the houses that people use, in the value of their houses, and they often give their children this money.
But I think one benefit when you're a student is the long holidays, and you can use that time to work if you want to. I mean, I also took a gap year, and so I had 2 or 3 months, and I washed cars for that time, and I managed to get some money to then travel to Thailand and Japan. So I think that's a lot of people do that as well. Use the break you have, try and work hard, earn the money, and then use it. And obviously, for the people who do take gap years, depending on where you go in the world, but you can find that accommodation can be much. The money you earn can go a long way. The accommodation and the living costs when you're traveling, if it's somewhere like Africa or Southeast Asia, then some money can go a long way.
British students learn languages, for example, in different Europe countries, yeah? And what languages they prefer? Because here, if we ask students, maybe everybody say we want to learn English because world speak English. So, but as for British students,
I think probably the most popular is French and Spanish, purely based on the number of people around the world who speak these languages. Today, many people learn Chinese, and this is more popular now. Even in some schools, they're teaching Chinese language. But it's actually very difficult. I think British people are probably, British and American people are maybe the worst people in the world for learning languages because we already speak English. That's a very good. So we speak a little bit of Russian, which we learned to come here. I speak some French. In Africa, I worked in French a little bit, but I think it is true that British people are bad at languages generally because we speak already English. I think it's much. It's for a British person. I always think for a British person, it's good that we speak English because it's obviously good to be able to talk to people from all over the world. But it's also bad because it makes it harder for us to learn other languages because everyone talks to us in English, like you're doing. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think actually inside the UK, it's interesting that there's a language which was dying out, and it's re-emerged, and that's Welsh. So in the west of the UK. So I think there was just a small number of people who spoke Welsh, and in the last few years, that's been brought back into schools. When you're driving around, road signs are in English and in Welsh, and it's a very different language. So it doesn't look at all like English, and you've seen a resurgence in the last few years. So as well as like globalism, there's more local language movements as well.
Testing? Oh, yeah. Honestly, I'm not interested about politics issues, and I'm sorry about that. So we were informed that we're going to talk about theater, literature. Can you say more words about that?
Is there a particular aspect of theatre and literature?
No. Is there any projects that we can be involved in? So, thank you.
I suppose. I mean, I think a good start would be if you have a look at the year of language and literature. If you go to the British Council website, British Council in Russia, and look at what the activities they're involved with on English and Russian language and literature, and the exchange that's happening between the UK and Russia, I think that's probably a good start. Unfortunately, in my mind, I don't have a sort of a clear. I'm not sure if there are specific activities you can take part in here in Goda Altai, for example. But I think it should be quite informative when you have a look on the website. I don't know if you've got anything to add on that. No. Yeah.
It's an interesting question. I think it's obviously a difficult question. I think Jonathan spoke a little bit at the beginning about this. So we always talk a lot about the things which unite us, particularly at the moment, rather than cause some tension. So in our embassy, we talk a lot about cultural links, we talk a lot about the veterans from the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, where Britain and Russia worked together, and we commemorate this. So we always try to remember that we have a very long history and very strong connections. But obviously the reason for your question is that at the moment there are some tensions. And yeah, I think at the moment the relationship is in a difficult phase. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Right now it's not the best that it's been. And I think that probably the main reason maybe is that, as you say, the sanctions issue, and it's, being very frankly, it's because the British government and the Russian government have very different opinions about the situation in Ukraine and what happened in Ukraine. And this is where the majority of this, there are some much bigger issues. So the British government and the Russian government also disagree on things like NATO. I'm sure you follow all of these arguments, but they disagree on NATO. Should NATO exist? Should NATO not exist? What should it do? What shouldn't it do? And we just have very different opinions, and our opinions are completely different. So in my job in Moscow, maybe 2 times every week, I go to your foreign ministry and I speak to your diplomats about Ukraine, and we have discussions, and I say what the British government thinks, and they tell me what the Russian government thinks about Crimea, about sanctions. Maybe I talk to them about the situation in Georgia, and they tell me what Russia thinks about Georgia, and it's my job to say what Britain thinks, and we try a little bit to understand each other. But frankly speaking, the differences are quite big at the moment. And as for the sanctions, again, it's obviously a very difficult issue, and lots of people at very senior levels talking about this very frequently. But for us, the sanctions are very much linked to the situation in Ukraine, which, as I said, we have very different opinions about. And if the situation in Ukraine could be resolved and peace could come back along the lines of the Minsk agreement, I don't know how much you follow this, then this is the trigger for removing sanctions, and this is how that would work. I don't know if that answers your question. Or yes, certainly. Do you mean in terms of employment in Britain?
I'm sure Sam will contribute on this as well, but I think the shape of British, I think, is a reflection of what Britain is strong at. And in a few decades ago, it was a lot about manufacturing and production, and so the construction, engineering were some of the top jobs. I think the shape of the economy's changed in the last few years, and it's become more service-based, more financial-based. And so you're seeing more, although there's still a significant number involved in construction engineering, there's much more now in law, in finance, and especially in computer technology, IT, and internet programming. That's a real growth industry. But I think alongside that you have certain very niche areas as well. And I think there's bits of science which, although as an overall they're quite small, but I think they're still very significant as part of the overall picture. But certainly, if you look at London, I see the law and the banks and accountancy firms. They all take in enormous numbers of graduates each year who choose to specialise in those areas.
Yeah, I would mention one more, which is creative industries. So Britain has a very strong tradition of making films, making drama programs like War and Peace that Jonathan mentioned. The BBC is very good at making these dramas and documentaries, and we have some really strong traditional studios like Pinewood that makes the James Bond films and has been doing so for many years. And this is British people are very proud of these creative industries, I think.
I wonder if I could use that as an opportunity to ask the students here, what are your aspirations and what would you like to do once you have graduated?
Maybe we could come back to this.
Probably still we don't know, and what should we be waiting for. But probably we are all will continue our study to get master degree and so on. Probably part of our students from our group, I mean, go to schools to work because after practice in school, we decided that it's not really bad job to be a teacher. Really, because in Russia there is some stereotypes that the profession of the teacher is really difficult and not really good paid, but I think that from all jobs it's not really bad one. And studying, of course studying, because it's too less, only 4 years of studying, and you know.
Yeah, but anyway, all of our students want to connect their future profession with language, as we study English, basically, and some of us want to be English teachers, some want to be translators, some want to work abroad, for example, or to study abroad, to use our language.
Russian people very like English very much, I think, and a lot of people, even young people in the school, children, kids like to learn it, want to learn it, and parents want that their kids know the English, and I think that is very popular language in our country. That's all I think.
That's very interesting, thank you. And it's very, obviously, when we hear people say they like English, it makes us very happy.
The lack of practice is the main problem for our students, as we are so far from the native speakers. That's why we really need your help.
Yes, we need more. More people to speak.
Native speakers, especially young people who can come and communicate with our students, because it's much easier and more interesting for them to talk to their.
So you mentioned that this year is Shakespeare's anniversary, and you know, I have a question about Shakespeare, authorship question. So, what do you think? Who was the real Shakespeare? Was it just pen name or the real person? You know, these things.
Sam said I can answer that one. I don't know. I don't know the answer. But I think, and I'm sure that debate will go on. I mean, I hope I'm right in saying most scholars think that there was someone called Shakespeare who wrote the vast majority of the works of what we know is Shakespeare. And I think what is clear is that it's the quality of the literature is fantastic, and there is this body of literature which speaks to people across cultures and in different points in history. Although the debate around exactly what he wrote and what he didn't will continue, but what we have is a fantastic body of literature which most people agree was written by Shakespeare, which is very powerful and which speaks to and which relates to the whole human experience, life and death and conflict and love, and for that reason is very powerful and works across cultures. So I think I'm not sure I'd have much more on that one.
I also think that it's very interesting. Maybe you're not aware of this, when I meet people around the world, including actually very strongly in Russia, often people from different countries know more about Shakespeare, and they will be able to recite more of Shakespeare's works and sonnets than British people. I think that actually now in some British schools they don't teach Shakespeare very much. They teach what they consider to be more modern works, and I know that in other countries though Shakespeare is still taught a lot and people know this. So for me it's sometimes ironic that British people sometimes know less about Shakespeare than Russian people. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I think the contribution of Russian literature is immense, and there is a recognition of that in the UK, and there should probably be even more, to be honest. I think although from a young age, I think British people don't have don't do a lot of reading of Russian literature, but I think as they get older, they become more aware of it and more exposed to it, and so. That includes Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Pushkin, and as we mentioned, some of our mainstream institutions look at these works and use them, and so the War and Peace, when BBC produced War and Peace, which I think is in Russian now and has been shown on Russian TV, there were millions of British people watched that, and they really enjoyed it. One thing that's very popular in the UK is what we call period dramas. So it's a drama set in a historical context, maybe 100, 200 years ago, with very traditional costumes and sets. And so whether that's about Britain 200 years ago, Russia 200 years ago, it always gets very high readership or people watching it. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if at least 5 million people watched War and Peace when it was on the BBC. Thank you. And just to say from us, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And I wanted just to say as well, your English language is excellent. And when you speak, I just encourage you to have confidence, because it's very good and very clear. Everyone who's asked a question has been very clear, and it's been very impressive.
I would agree with that, and also from me, thank you very much for you coming today and spending your time talking to us too. It's been very interesting, and I certainly hope that we will come back and talk some more. Very nice to meet you all.